This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought, and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I am Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dahlia Shenlin. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and other interesting things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is a professor of philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's currently in Israel for a launch event at the Van Leer Institute of the Hebrew edition of his 2011 book, A Book Forged in Hell, Spinoza's Scandalous Treatise on the Birth of the Secular Age. But he has since published two more books, including most recently the book that we'll be talking about, Heretics. And I say it like that because there is an exclamation point. Heretics, the Wondrous and Dangerous Beginnings of Modern Philosophy. It is a graphic book, which he co-authored with his son, Ben Nadler, published by Princeton University Press. Professor Stephen Nadler, hello and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, let's avoid the obvious first question and start with asking you why you decided to write a graphic novel about philosophy.
The editor who I've worked with at Princeton University Press asked me if I would write a history of philosophy in the 17th century. And I said, well, that doesn't seem exceedingly interesting. It's been done before, and that's kind of just rehashing a lot of material that's already out there. But I was thinking of different ways to kind of frame that project. And at the same time, my son Ben was graduating from art school, the Rhode Island School of Design. And I thought, well, this could be an interesting opportunity to get him started in his career. And so I proposed to him that we do something together. And we came up with the idea of taking this notion of a history of philosophy in the 17th century and doing it as a graphic novel. And we pitched that to Princeton, and much to our surprise, they were happy to give it a shot. They had never published a graphic book before, but they were keen to go with it.
You wanted your students to finally read what you give them to read? Is that
I hope they read it after they've read The Philosophers.
Right.
So it shouldn't be a replacement?
Yes. So the audience we had in mind was as broad as you can imagine, everything from high school students to even adolescents who are interested in seeing what philosophy is about, through college students and any adults out there who want a good introduction to philosophy in the period.
And do you think this is a phase in history or in philosophical history that is particularly kind of amenable to this graphic novel representation? Is it a particular drama of that era that you think lends itself well to this kind of representation?
That's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of philosophical drama because this really was people say Descartes is the father of modern philosophy. Modern philosophy begins in the 17th century. And those kinds of black and white claims, it's hard to say when exactly modern philosophy begins, but something really special, interesting happened in the 17th century where philosophy became an enterprise that was grounded in reason and experiment and experience, not so much in paying fealty to ancient authorities like Aristotle or the church. So something special really was happening. I would say it was probably, with the possible exception of 5th century Athens, or 5th and 4th century Athens, the most fertile period in the history of philosophy. Everything you think of, those now modern philosophy, Galileo, Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, Newton, John Locke, Hobbes, and so on. But it also did seem, to get back to your question, it did seem really amenable to a visual representation because philosophy in the 17th century was a very social enterprise. These people corresponded with each other. They had relations, not just through their ideas, but personal relations. In some cases, they visited each other. And there's a great deal of debate. And of course, then you have the wars and the politics and the religion of the 17th century, which can be very colorful.
Well, that's why I think what is very interesting about this era is that actually we're talking about a period of unorthodoxies, right? The philosophers were rebellious, they were critical, creative, and iconoclastic. Do you hope that in a way the form of your book matches the content that you're talking about by being a little bit iconoclastic in the representation of philosophy?
I do, and Ben had real carte blanche to do what he wanted with the illustrations. We tried to keep both the text and the images as historically accurate as possible. You know, you look at the way they're dressed, certainly captured the way they looked, even the architecture and the design of the spaces.
And the look on their faces when they're being burned alive is just so realistic.
It's classic. That's how you look when you're being burned alive. Yeah, well, we tried to really get into this book. However, at the same time, Ben had carte blanche to be as creative as he wanted to, and there were a lot of anachronisms in the book. As far as I know, they didn't have MacBook Pros in the 17th century. God wasn't playing with a laptop. There are school buses in the book in one image. And, there are 900 drawings, and in one of them, one of the philosophers is dancing under a disco ball. we tried to keep the humor restrained, but sometimes the imagination of a 26-year-old illustrator just out of art school will run away.
Did you have to simplify things to allow itself to be adapted to that format more than you would have thought or been willing to normally?
Not more than I was willing to, but more than I thought would be necessary. The first draft, it took me several months to get a really good draft that was illustratable. The first draft, I basically wrote down everything I knew about 17th century philosophy. I wanted to make sure that I didn't destroy my reputation. And so it almost read like a textbook introduction to philosophy. And I sent it to Ben. And we were working at a distance. He was in Seattle at the time. I was in Madison, Wisconsin. So all this was done by email and by phone. And he read it and he said, "Dad, this is just too dense. It's too much. It's too wordy. This is not going to be something that's going to work." So I went back and various drafts of the text went back and forth between us. And eventually we came up with a fairly, I don't want to say simplistic, because what we wanted to avoid above all else was a condescending, patronizing, childish text. But we did have to do a lot of simplifying because we wanted this book, and especially the philosophy, to be accessible to people who maybe knew nothing about philosophy.
Did Ben know anything about philosophy before?
Well, that's an interesting question, too, because I had sent him a couple of books on philosophy to maybe get a head start. I don't think he read them at all.
They should be teaching philosophy at RISD, shouldn't they?
Well, he took a philosophy course at RISD, and when he came home and he had his box of books, I noticed that the spine of the philosophy book hadn't even been cracked.
Well, this actually ties into another question I have. I mean, it seems like we're living in an age when funding in universities and the general prioritization of the humanities and liberal arts is being deprioritized relative to science and engineering, and the funding that goes into that is seen as much higher priority. Can this book or this endeavor in a way be seen as a little bit of a pushback, sort of using by hook or by crook, trying to get people back, back engaged back in more traditional liberal arts?
I certainly hope so. I mean, the point of studying philosophy, maybe in a few cases, is to become a professional philosopher. But the reason why it's a great major, or at least you have this opportunity in your 4 years of university to take a philosophy course, is because you also want to be an informed and responsible citizen. And I think what that requires is the ability to assess arguments, look at evidence, and understand what it is to be a rational person in the world. And unfortunately, the world is seeming less and less rational, especially in light of recent American politics, if I can get political for a minute.
No.
I think there's a great deal of intellectual stupidity, by which I mean not a lack of education or lack of knowledge, but a refusal to be rational and tailoring your beliefs to the evidence. And what philosophy is all about is learning how to be not just logical, but also how to be rational, how to make sure that your beliefs are justified, and how to modify your beliefs so that they do fit what is reasonable.
Well, I think that raises an interesting question about the particular controversies of of the age that you're looking at. In the 17th century, it seems to me that the orthodoxies were much greater and more politically powerful, and the heresies, therefore, much more extreme. The idea of questioning the nature of the solar system lands you, on the stake sometimes. And so I wonder if what you're saying is really correct, because now there's sort of more parity between people who are science-based and rational-based and those who kind of question it. I mean, think about the debate over climate change. You have two camps in America, and we absolutely disparage the camp who refuses to look at science, because that's because science is more the orthodoxy in a way. So where are we really relative to the controversies of the 17th century? Aren't we still in a better position now
No, it's
than
even
we were
more
then?
than that. I mean, the heresy today, it comes from people who are, the establishment and the orthodoxies against which they protest are the ones that were paved by those 17th
Right, it's
century.
kind of flipped around.
Exactly.
Right.
Now,
So basically you're telling people, look up to them, think rationally, don't be afraid to speak out. And what you end up with is this fiesta of ignorance.
right. I mean, take your lead from people like Descartes and Spinoza, who, to be fair to them, they didn't think, well, Spinoza's an exception, and maybe Hobbes as well, but most of the philosophers in the book did not think of themselves as heretics. They thought themselves as innovators, and they're certainly aware that what they were saying was contrary to the reigning orthodoxy. But at the same time, they didn't think of themselves as heretics. Some of them were quite devout. Descartes and Leibniz, and especially Newton, thought that they could reconcile their philosophical views with the church, with religious orthodoxy. But I think you're absolutely right. Today, what counts as heresy, at least in certain societies, is what is perfectly rational. At the same time, you could say that the people who refuse to be rational, who won't vaccinate their children, who deny the science of climate change, who vote into office a man who is so obviously unprepared and unfit for office, these are people who are just refusing to look the evidence in the face and form their beliefs in a responsible manner.
How do you educate them? I mean, I don't know if educating is the right word, but what do you tell them as a trained philosopher with, because this book at the end of the day is a handbook of sorts, isn't it?
Yeah, the next step is always difficult. My own personal approach is when I come across somebody who seems to be really refusing to be responsible. They'll make a claim, and my simplest response is, well, why do you believe that? Well, they saw it on Fox News. Well, why do you believe them? And if you just keep pushing that question far enough, you force them to think not just about what they believe, but why they believe what they believe.
Or how they believe it.
And how they believe it, yeah.
But of course, they would ask the same thing to us. Well, where do you get your information? I mean, maybe not you as a philosopher or maybe not a scientist, but they'll say to, the liberal camp or the climate change camp, why do you believe it? Well, I heard it on MSNBC and I heard it on CNN. I read it in the New York Times. Oh, because the New York Times says it, then it's true. So how do you break through that?
Because that's not our final answer. And we go past the media outlets to have a certain confidence in the empirical sources that they're reporting on. So I don't think there's very much that I believe simply because I read it in a newspaper or saw it on TV, but I know the sources. I'm no scientist, so I can't assess a lot of the science that's behind climate change, but I certainly have confidence that the people who are bringing the evidence to our attention know what they're doing because of their credentials.
Right.
There's a certain refusal to show respect for expertise these days. Part of it is this notion that experts are elites, and we don't like elites. I would rather have elites running things, people who really have some kind of expertise and knowledge, than the person you want to have a beer with.
I'm thinking about the fact that the climate change debate, we're using it as an example, and to some extent the vaccination debate, is very much bound with politics, right? These are political themes in our day, and it goes back to the period that we're looking at in the book, the 17th century. I mean, so much of these, it's true that they didn't necessarily think of themselves as heretics, but they were certainly treated as heretics.
Yeah.
And it's not just about a philosophical divide or theology versus philosophy. Of course, theology is completely bound up with politics at that time. These people were political threats. So are we just seeing the new form of centuries-old sort of struggle between theology as politics and people who would think scientifically and therefore challenge them politically?
I think in some cases that is the case because especially given the political power of evangelicals in the United States, and I'm not going to address the power of the religious parties in Israel, but a lot to the extent that politics is informed by religious beliefs and even religious dogma, I think what we're seeing is a return to the past and, at least in the United States, a violation of our constitutional foundation. Policies are not supposed to be directed by religious beliefs. And that's why, at least in my opinion, gay marriage, climate change, and a whole host of issues, these are not political issues. These shouldn't be political issues. There's no reason why a democratic, liberal, modern society should have any legislation about who can marry whom.
I want to go back to philosophy and
Yes.
to the book. Do you think that there are other periods in the history of philosophy that could be adapted to a graphic book? You said that the 17th century is very dramatic and therefore it lends itself to it. But do you think that we can really tell the whole story of Western philosophy from, I don't know how many centuries BC until today in graphic form?
I think you could. Actually, Ben is now working with another author for Princeton University Press, a graphic book on the trial and death of Socrates. So I think 5th and 4th century Athens, or 5th and 4th century Greek philosophy would be very nice. He would only have to worry about one kind of dress. They're all wearing sheets.
Sure.
But I think you think of Socrates' life as fairly picturesque. I think another possibility would be a history of philosophy in Europe in the 20th century. Very easy to depict Sartre and de Beauvoir and Camus sitting in cafes in Paris. The ideas might be difficult. I mean, how do you illustrate being and nothingness? Someone asked me if we were going to do a follow-up to this book with the 18th century, kind of the natural sequel. That I thought would be a little bit more difficult. There was less contentiousness between the philosophers and trying to illustrate Hume's views on causation or Rousseau's views on the state. I'll let somebody else handle that one.
Because on the one hand, it is a very good educational tool.
Yeah.
I mean, basically, it's very easy to put complex ideas across. On the other hand, some ideas in philosophy are too complex. I'm sure that even when you write textbooks for your students, some of those ideas are too opaque for them.
Yeah, that's why I don't write textbooks on principle, because I think the students should read the philosophers themselves.
Which is even harder for them.
It is, but that's how they become philosophers. My job is not to make them people who know something about philosophy, but people who have philosophical sense. If they're just sitting there taking notes about what I say a philosopher said, then they're not really thinking. They're just writing down what I say.
Yeah,
But then they come to you and say, I didn't understand anything. What do you do?
He gets involved in dialectic with them. And they have a sort of,
I asked them, what did you understand? And what didn't you understand about it? And why didn't you understand it? Were you in class? That's the first question I asked.
but this really does go back to your point that you started to make earlier about the difference between being educated and having sort of a way of thinking that is grounded in logic and evidence and philosophical thinking.
Right.
It's not the same as accumulating information.
That's why I think Socrates is such an important model here, because when the first thing I have my students read every semester is the Euthyphro, one of Plato's earliest dialogues. And the issue in the Euthyphro is Socrates is trying to convince Euthyphro, not only does he not know what piety is, so Euthyphro is on his way to the courts to prosecute his father, because his father is responsible for the death of a man. And Socrates says, well, why are you going to the courts to do that? That's a very serious thing. And Euthyphro says, well, it's the pious thing to do. And over the course of their dialogue, Socrates tries to figure out not just whether Euthyphro knows that what he's doing is the pious thing, but whether he also knows what piety is. So the important thing that a philosopher or someone who's being trained to be philosophical has to do is not just know whether or not the actions they're performing are right or wrong, but do they actually know what it is for an action to be right or wrong? Sort of a second-order set of principles. It's not just I have to make the right choices, but the values that inform my choices have to be ones that I have examined, and I'm persuaded, not because somebody told me that they're the right values, but because I have seen through reason that this is what justice is, this is what goodness is.
It's interesting. I hate to be all Trumpian and kind of be influenced by the last thing I heard, but I did just read an interesting article yesterday examining the life and death of Socrates in light of current American politics and sort of comparing, Trump as a leader as the antithesis of who Socrates was as a personal example. And I know we're going way, way back, into a different era from the book, but still it's interesting that the argument was that Socrates also lived a personal example in his life of somebody who was striving for the truth constantly with no personal ambition or personal gain for the most part. And when he was offered the chance to escape from prison and save his life by his students who arranged it, he said, no, I've lived by the law. I'm going to die by the law. Why am I raising that? Because I just want to understand to what extent the personal example of the philosopher is where it is in relation to the philosopher's ideas.
I think when you look at who are the true philosophical heroes in history, people who not just had these abstract conceptions of the good life, but who actually put it into practice and tried to get other people to lead good lives. So Socrates, I think, is a shining example. Spinoza, I find to be an extremely wise and heroic individual.
What about his personal example makes you say that?
I think he lived the life that he thought was the right way to live. I think his courage in publishing ideas about the Bible, Spinoza claimed that the Bible is nothing but a work of human literature. His views on happiness, his views about the place of religion in society, on freedom, on democracy, these were extremely bold things. And you can look at the philosophers in Heretics and say, yeah, that's interesting. Descartes said that. Leibniz said that. But if you're walking down the street of Tel Aviv or New York or Madison, Wisconsin, you're not going to find a lot of Cartesians or Leibnizians. But you will find people who say, yep, Spinoza got it right. And how many philosophers can you look at in history and say, yep, they got it right?
Well, the question about whether he got it right is very interesting because he envisions a society where religion is really, really constrained in terms of its influence on political life with full liberal freedoms that even nowadays we're not really able to implement them as much as he probably would have liked. And I wonder, he may have gotten it right, but how much did he get it realistically? Can we really ever limit the role of a certain religious conservatism, even in secular democracy?
Why not?
Because we haven't been able to. The proof is in history.
Well, it depends who we is. I mean, if you look at societies like the Netherlands and Sweden, they're awfully close to a kind of society that is both tolerant, open, and respectful of religious differences, but doesn't allow those religious influence to govern public policy.
I guess I'm thinking of certainly America, right, as the big shining example of promise.
And also we're
right?
at a very low ebb in the history, in the evolution of those ideas in the 21st century.
I mean, this is also an interesting question. Is this always going to be linear progress towards those ideas, or is there always going to be this conservative backlash?
There's always backsliding. I mean, that's history. Unless you have this really Whiggish linear view of how history operates. I mean, you brought up Trump. We had 8 years of real fine leadership, informed, knowledgeable leadership. And now we have the Socratic anti-hero, somebody who just, as you said before, why should we care about the truth? As far as I can tell, Trump doesn't care about the truth at all. But more importantly, and this is what makes him the Socratic anti-hero, he's ignorant of his own ignorance. He has no conception of what he does and doesn't know. And that's a really dangerous thing to have.
Does he, or just he does? Maybe he just doesn't care.
I don't think, well, it depends. The way he presents himself, he doesn't care. But I think I don't want to get too into, I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not going to start diagnosing. But I think he doesn't really know. It takes a certain level of close self-examination to look and realize what you do and don't know. And I'm not sure he has the attention to do that.
We all know what Socrates said about life unexamined.
Yes.
I want to go back to Spinoza for a second.
Okay.
As you said, he really stood out in the landscape, philosophical, intellectual landscape, religious, certainly, societal landscape of his time. Do you think that he would have been more at ease in the 18th or 19th centuries if he got to live then?
I think he would have seen progress. It's hard to know whether he would have been at ease. It depends where you put him. But I think if he were to have more of a long-term view of things and seen how by the 18th century there is this thing that we now call the Enlightenment, where you were less likely to be persecuted for your ideas. It was still, you were still always at risk. And just as you were at risk in the United States in the 1950s for promoting certain political views. So as you said, there's always backsliding. But on the whole, I think Spinoza would look at the general trajectory of things and think that, well, perhaps we're moving closer to the kind of ideal republic.
Unless he lived through Romanticism, in which case he might have had a different...
That's right.
Yeah, it depends where, as I said.
But the thing about Spinoza is that he's a kind of Rorschach test. People see in him exactly what they want to see. So if you're a romantic, you're going to see Spinoza as your arch romantic. He's an atheist. He's a mystic. He's a defender of rabbinic tradition. He's a Bundist. He's everywhere.
It sounds like the interpretation.
Right, yes. People see exactly what they want to see.
It sounds like the interpretations of Jesus. I have another question that just occurred to me while we're talking about this post-truth Trumpianism, again, not to focus too much on Trump, but he does sort of overshadow things and raise philosophical questions. Maybe your next book should be about the postmodernists, because I think we're living in an era where something about postmodernism has filtered into the popular level, and people at the very least have sort of scratched taken the surface of it and said, well, what is truth really? All of these things that are presented to us all are being presented by a messenger with an agenda, and the agenda is some hidden agenda that we can strip through and see that the truth isn't really what it seems to be, and we can't really access the truth. And so, therefore, you can convince the entire public that what the liberal truth is telling you is not the real truth, but my truth is real. I mean, do we blame the postmodernists for this or what?
It's hard to know how much an academic movement, how much influence it has. And I know it's popular on certain media circles to blame academic postmodernists. And I'm not a fan of postmodernism thought. I think life is too short to try to figure out what it is they're saying. And so I'm certainly no expert on it. But as a philosopher, and I think I speak for most philosophers, we believe there is truth. And I'll be in a conference involving a lot of people from humanities disciplines, and at one point someone will say, well, there really is no truth, or what's true now is what was true in the 13th century. Who's to say who's right or wrong, what truth is? And it's always the philosophers who stand up and say, well, no, there are truths, and it's our job to figure out what they are. So, if I had enough patience and insight into postmodernism, I think that'd be a worthwhile project. But I am contemplating a book called On Stupidity, kind of a follow-up to Harry Frankfurt's book on bullshit. So Frankfurt's definition of bullshit is that you don't really care what's true. Your point is to persuade somebody. So it's different from lying, where the liar has a certain conception of what's true. The bullshitter doesn't have any conception or care about what's true.
Isn't that kind of the basic meaning of sophistry?
Yeah, I suppose the bullshitter uses sophistry and rhetoric to persuade people. Stupidity is just something different. It's different from ignorance. It's different from blindness. It's different from a lack of knowledge. It's different from a lack of education. It's a kind of epistemic irresponsibility, not, as I said before, not tailoring your beliefs in the right way. And I think a lot of what is happening in the world today is due to bullshitters on the one hand and the stupidity that they can easily take advantage of.
Will it be a graphic novel?
That would be a good one, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Illustrate bullshit. Exactly. I'm thinking of, the next generation. How does philosophy happen now? You have this nice panel where Descartes is going around and basically just thinking. I mean, you did manage, your son did manage to illustrate that. He's thinking in his office. He's thinking near a tree. He's musing over the nature of knowledge at a pub, and he's even thinking in his sleep. Nowadays, how does that happen? People are running from app to app. And I know you have a few, you have an Apple computer or something in the panels, but still, people are really running around. They're not strolling by the trees thinking about them as a metaphor for metaphysics. So, or am I just being the old fogey here saying, oh, the youth of today,
I agree
Is this
with
changing
you.
how we think?
I agree with you entirely. I see, since I'm not a psychologist, I've never done an experiment to test this, but you see a lack of attention, an inability to take in complex information and reflect on it. Everything has to come now in 140 characters, or the length of attention span seems to be shrinking. I see that in my students. I see it in my own kids. Ben will be working on something. He'll have one screen going, another screen going, music's playing. And he says he can take it all in. Maybe he can. But you don't see people reading books. You don't see people having conversations. You go into a cafe and everyone's got their laptops or phones out. They're always looking at screens. So I'm the one who's sounding like an old fogey here. But I think to be philosophical, to be rationally responsible, takes a lot of effort. It takes an extended span of attention.
I'm wondering if you should have your students not just read the material, but actually assign them, for homework to take a few hours in their day and live differently.
That's a great idea. I do discourage them from taking notes in class because I want them to be involved in the give and take. If they're just taking notes, they're writing down what I'm saying. If they can't take notes, then they have to respond to the questions I ask them. They have to ask me questions, and they have to respond to each other. And then I encourage them to, after class, take 10 minutes. Then you do your notes, and you have to recreate in your mind everything that happened in class, which will force you to think and reflect on the conversation that took place.
Professor Stephen Nadler, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the co-author of the recently published Heretics, the Wondrous and Dangerous Beginnings of Modern Philosophy, a graphic book co-authored with your son, Ben Nadler. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And a big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. We'd also like to thank Peter Fry and Carrie Shapiro and the Romai Foundation, who made a very generous contribution to the Tel Aviv Review. You too can help us survive and even have your name mentioned as a donor. So if you want to, please write to us. Write to Gilad at gilad@tlv1.fm, and we'll tell you how to do it. In the meantime, don't forget to check out our archives on www.tlv1.fm/podcasts. There are almost 400 interviews, and we think you should listen to all of them. Like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review, Ideas from Israel. Follow both Gilad and me on Twitter. And join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. Until then, goodbye.